We're rolling.
Every unit I tell you the same thing. I'd like you to memorize this speech soon so that you can all say it with me. But the stars do not predict the content of the exam. The only reason that I do this entire ritual every unit is I've noticed some content is either a persistent misunderstanding of my students. I can predict that some of this content will come up later in my course, or experience has shown me that some of this content shows up on AP exams regularly. So when I give you stars, I'm just saying, yo, heads up, make sure that you have the best notes possible. Talk to your friends, improve on these notes. Because it's not just something that you would simply copy out of the book. Like the stuff without the stars is just sort of like I expect you to have learned this directly from the book. In case you're curious, you have to know the entire study guide for the exam. In the order of the study guide. Primary and secondary production. Facilitation, interference. All the types of diversity, the founder effect, biological soil crust.
Are these all the vocabs for all of them?
What blood?
Like the vocab? Is this the vocab for like the whole entire like chapter or unit?
I'm going through all vocabs first. The different types of extinction, and pretty much all of the words in the reading packet list. Study goals 2, 4, 5, 7, 12, 13, 15, 18, 19, 21, 23, and a warning. On study goal number 23, the prompt told you, save space for content in class. I gave you that content, I just didn't tell you. That was the extinction lecture on the endangered species assignment. And that was number 23?
No, you just had us take notes.
Right. So my point is that I told you these are important notes. I recommended that you put them on the back of the endangered species assignment. And I'm telling you now that wherever you have them, the extinction notes go with study goal 23. Oh, and the extinction notes also had this little side trip. That's study goal 18, and I'll talk about that again later today. Okay, 25, 27, 28. 25, 27, 28. 30, 31, 34, 38, 39, 40, 42, 44, and 48. Please take out your bio notes.
if I add a college later on, can I do that? Like if I visit a school and I like it,
It'll cost you one burrito.
I was already thinking about bringing you a burrito this morning.
Okay, it'll cost you 2 burritos.
Show stuff.
Joke's on you. Biomes. My hope today, if everything goes according to plan, my hope today would be to quickly discuss deserts and wetlands. I need to talk a little bit about study goal number 18, and then I'll have a little bit of time for you to ask me about missing stuff. That might include the film, the reader, the field trip. Anybody who didn't go on the field trip, I'd like to pull those students aside and make sure that they got a couple of words that were unique to the field trip. And I'll also pass back all the Unit 2 stuff, including your Unit 2 exam, in case somebody needs to appeal their free response grade.
Have you seen any problems with the Scanton, or is it fine?
I have not. So far in periods 1, 3, and 5, one kid got misgraded for one bubble. And it doesn't look to be his fault, obviously, to me, but I think I'm going to stick to my policy of making that between him and the machine. Yeah?
Is that what you're gonna, for the unit 1 exam that we like appealed the multiple choice for like the broken Scantron paper? Like, did those ever get, like they never got changed like in my grade, but like.
So yours may not have changed, but most students felt that they had changed. We were able to rule out the ones which were definitely a paper issue. So if your grade hasn't changed, you looked today and it's the same grade?
I mean, I looked yesterday.
What time yesterday?
During school.
See me during seminar today? Or any time in the next quarter, and we can check that paper and see if you deserve more points or not. There was definitely some kids where it was definitely a paper problem, and we could figure that out. I don't know if that's the case for you. Maybe it is and we just forgot. Or maybe I made a mistake. You know, the whiskey tumbler on David's report is not very accurate. What?
Where are the staplers?
I put them away. And I said if anybody needs staplers. I say Levinthal was like, ah. Okay. Where do we leave off on the bios?
Desert. Just started.
We had just started desert?
Yeah.
Did I mention that it's the world's largest terrestrial biome?
Yes.
Did I mention that it's really kidding. Did I tell you that everybody thinks they're sand dunes, but they're not all sand dunes?
Yes.
Okay. Did I tell you that they have tremendous temperature variation? Extreme temperature variation within a single day? And frequent, tiny rains. Like Santa Barbara gets 7 days of rain for the year. And that's all of our rain in 7 days. Deserts are the opposite. They'll get like about that much rainfall, give or take. But that's just spread out over like daily or every other day, little tiny 30-second storms. They're frequent, but they're small amounts of water. You gotta know that. That's actually a unique thing about deserts. There's never a ton of water around. There's always a little bit of water around. So the adaptations that we see in the desert are avoiding the daytime because it sucks. There's a lot of nocturnal life. Because nighttime is brutal. Sorry, daytime is brutal. Excuse me, thank you. Obviously the storage of water, maybe you've heard of like camels and cactus.
Wait, what?
Camels grow water in their humps, cactus grow water in their
Coincidentally, camels don't store water in their humps.
That's the widespread information.
I know. They transform water into fat because the breaking of carbon, like cellular respiration, gives off water.
Basically, that's
It's not like a water bag that you would puncture and water comes out. I mean, you puncture a camel, you get a greasy knife. Okay. You get a greasy knife.
I mean, probably also bloody as well.
Wait, that's crazy.
Okay, anyway, back to me. How many of you thought that camels actually stored water, like liquid water, like a dromedary bag in their hump?
Like, I never thought of
Well, when Katie just told me, I believed her.
not like
Yes.
actually water, but like they.
I mean, Ava and I did. I really did believe that for a very long time. I walked up to a camel and I was like, I can't hear the water. Fun fact about evolutionary biology in deserts, probably not worth putting into your notes. Because plants have to compete for water, they have root warfare. They use chemical warfare through their roots. They try to poison and confuse each other's roots.
That's awesome.
And that was studied by a nerd at UCS Brodog who's still there, old timer, white guy. Forget his name. He was part of our lunch group, so I can tell you who his friends are, but I'll remember his name right after this class is over, I'm sure. But you know, a little cactus has this ring of roots that is giant, and on the outsides, it like gives off gases to like scare away other roots so that it can take as much of that little sprinkle of water as it can get. There's something really special about the deserts, though. This will be our last thing, and then we move on. The thing about the sand dunes, you know, everybody visualizes these like oceans of sand that are all. Have you all seen the animations where if you speed it up, it moves like water?
Mm-hmm.
There's like swell
Or
and
if
like.
you pump air through sand, it becomes fluid.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. Fluidizing. But anyway, that visual that we all have about deserts is actually pretty rare and kind of inaccurate. On the entire planet, a very small percentage of deserts are sand dunes. They're a fluke of deserts. It's like a weird characteristic of a few deserts. Most deserts are vegetated. So this is the Chihuahua Desert. This is the Mojave Desert. This is the Sonoran Desert. And you'll notice they have quite a bit of vegetation. Like if you go in the spring, deserts are green. And the secret to all these plants, you know, if you try to grow these plants like down at the beach where we also have plenty of sand, they won't grow. There's a secret ingredient that's a critical feature of this ecology. The one thing I'd like you to add to your notes now is the biological soil crust. You can see this white substance in the foreground. In the background, you can see a sand dune. In between, there's a few plants. If you can please look at the picture, there's like sand, a couple of plants. Those plants are rooted in that white crust stuff. I'll warn you now that your future experience in science could include 1,000,000 terms for this soil crust. There's a bazillion different ways to describe it. There's a bazillion details of how it's formed and what lives there. You'll notice I said biological soil crusts with an S at the end because that's plural, because there's a bunch of different types. Some are colonized by fungus, some are colonized by bacteria, some of them are made through desiccation, some of them are made through sweating. And I don't even know all those terms. Every time I turn around, somebody will mention a new one, and I'm like, oh, I guess that's another type of biological soil crust. So that's a general term. If somebody, like, use your context clues. If they're talking about a crust on top of dirt, it's the same concept. And here's that concept. If you have like a glass jar, F, I had an example around
Top
here.
Q.
No, that one has a lid and it doesn't have the right problem. Anyway, I had this the flower vase, And it would sit over here all the time. There was a big ball jar where I would put my cut sunflowers. And because there's always water evaporating out, and you know, I set up my sunflowers and I ignore them for a week. All that water evaporating leaves what on the glass? When water evaporates from a glass, you get. Oh, that's what would happen if you were capturing it. Imagine that the water can escape. What's left on the glass?
Minerals?
Yeah, that's right. What color are they usually?
White.
That little ring that you get on the glass is minerals. When water evaporates, salts are left behind. And so remember I told you that the desert has frequent small rains. You water the rocks and minerals dissolve into the water. Then the water evaporates and those minerals will crystallize. And if you repeat this like 150 times a year for 10,000 years, I kinda hate my daughter. Every time I turn around, she changes my ring settings. What?
So there's like this really endangered like type of, I think it's the crust, like in Arizona and stuff. Is that the
Yep.
same thing?
Yeah.
Okay.
So like when you go to all the national parks in Moab, Utah, it's like arches and canyonlands and prices. You're not supposed to walk around off trail because you break the crust. That crust is mineralization, just crystals forming as water evaporates over and over and over and over and over and over and over again. If you repeat this like a bazillion times, you get like a delicate sponge. And this is the part where the things matter. Repeated evaporation, crystallized minerals, sponge. That sponge is going to hold water. It'll anchor seeds. And it's a place where decomposers get to live. So in a desert, you don't really have topsoil, but you have this weird crust that kind of functions like topsoil. It's delicate, so when you go climbing in the desert, you got to be careful where you walk around, because when you step on this crust, it won't heal for like 10,000 years.
Why does it matter?
Because without that, you get sand dunes, and plants don't grow in sand.
No, I mean like with dirt, if you swish the dirt to the side, it's still dirt. Like, what about this needs to...
That it's delicate as F. Like, I've got a visual for you. It is not my wearing pants that I rolled up like shorts. My visual for you is, I've got a visual for you. There's like green sponges that old ladies use to arrange flowers.
Oh, they're in a lot of ASMR.
Raise your hand if you know what I'm talking about. Those green sponges, if you like press on them, they just turn to dust. You know that?
They're the ones
Like if you drop one, it's like.
ASMR.
P.S. When I was a sophomore in high school, I took a flower arranging class, and it was like 17 ancient, crusty old ladies and me.
Oh, like out of school.
Yes, at the local city college. Yeah, in my free time.
Met his wife.
Yeah.
Your city college had a flower arranging class?
Ellen Hancock Community College, Lompton, California. That crust is delicate like those green sponges. If you press on it, it turns to dust. And once you've lost that sponge, then it's just sand, and you can't get the decomposers living in the sand. The sand doesn't hold water very well. The roots can't grow in the water. So all of these ecosystems, all this, it would all look like that. No life, no life, no life, except for lots of life, lots of life, lots of life. This whole ecosystem depends on that crust. Water, seeds, roots, decomposers. If you got the crust, we're done. Water storage, nocturnal. Underground, water storage. Yeah.
Can the like dunes and stuff ever recover back into the crust?
Yeah, but it's like a millennial process. It really is like thousands and thousands and thousands of years. Anybody else? Humans hate the desert, so it's pretty intact. Humans hate the desert, so it's pretty intact.
Do we need to make a note
Somebody
of
handle your
that?
attendance today or no? What?
Do we need to make a note of that, or is it kind of just common sense?
It's good to know all these numbers. There's a fun, wacky thing that you might want to know about deserts also, now that we're talking about human impacts. This is the only growing biome. Like in a world of climate change, the deserts are expanding. They're expanding quickly. A lot of the earth is becoming desert. A lot of the earth is becoming desert.
When you say
What?
terrestrial biome, like what does that mean?
Like not water, not aquatic. Land-based, like terrestrial. Like,
This sounds like a space.
oh yes, yes. Ava?
That crust is only in the sand deserts, right?
It's the magic that binds the sand into a usable surface. P.S. If you guys ever get a chance, there's places in the American Southwest where you can see historic damage in the crust. And Diego, I told you it takes thousands of years. Like, you can see footprints from wagon trains of like Manifest Destiny westward expansion. People go out to the desert and like follow those footprints and do research. Like, oh, you can see that Ma is limping, and like, oh, they lost one of the wagons here, and here was a raid by locals that seems to have killed off 4 of the people walking. So you can study the footprints.
How can they do that without breaking the soil?
I think they kind of do. And by the way, there's also tracks of the first tank ever built. Do you know the United States built the first tank for World War I?
Plastic.
So that was tested in the desert, and you can go see the tracks of the tank number 1. Yeah,
How are those tracks just not covered up by like sand and like the wind?
because like most of that landscape is still crusted and vegetated, and so it's like a dimple in the otherwise intact area. All right. We're not going to do aquatic biomes because the College Board doesn't really do aquatic biomes, which I think is kind of lame because most of the Earth's life is in the water. But they do like rivers and lakes, but they don't really talk about aquatic biomes.
Is this also called coastal forest?
I'll get to that. They do talk about wetlands, which are definition, land sometimes wet.
Really?
That's the whole definition. Land sometimes wet. So like a coastal forest that is flooded during rainy season. Plants that anchor into the tide line, so they're out of the water at low tide and they're underwater at high tide, like mangrove swamps. Every estuary, like what we saw on our field trip, where like sometimes it's wet and sometimes it's dry, it all floods in the winter and dries out in the summer here. Those are all wetlands. This is like a typical wetland. You can see that that water level is not distinct. That's going to get a lot of water in the wet season, and it's mostly going to drain out in the dry season, so that's a wetland. Sometimes wet, sometimes dry. I need you to imagine how the water got there. That was probably rain that hit like a forest or a park or some backyards or some streets or whatever. So you get a lot of water, which is runoff. So you get a lot of material, and you get a lot of dissolved nutrients. This is like a soup of compost. Runoff, material, dissolved nutrients. considering that there's plenty of sunlight and that makes it all warm, this is like super productive. Every time somebody says very productive, you got to imagine this. Please look up productivity, primary consumer, secondary consumer, but watch this, more productivity, more consumers. If I say hyper productivity, then that's going to be hell of consumers. Like if you want to find bugs, there's probably a lot of bugs because there's a lot of productivity. If a duck is migrating and they're looking for a pit stop, like, yeah, Walmart parking lot is a place, but that's super productive, so there's probably going to be more food for the ducks here. Water, dissolved nutrients, material, sunlight, warmth, hyperproductive. Other thing is they're super dynamic. These places are always changing. Now it's hot, now it's cold, now it's wet, now it's dry, now it's dirty, now it's clear. Like every time that you drive to UCSB, the buildings are the same, but every time you drive to UCSB, that lagoon over by the airport looks different. Yeah.
Does that mean that the animals that live in it are really good at adapting, or does it mean that it's more migratory?
It's exactly both. So those that are residents are especially adapted to all that change. They're very general if they're there full time. And separately, that's a great place to show up when you like some of the conditions, and then you would have to leave if you don't like the remaining conditions. So like, there's a couple weeks out of the year when the Carpinteria Slough is full of giant halibut. Because it's like the right time for them to get in there and lay their eggs, and that's like a breeding ground for giant halibut. P.S. That's illegal, don't say that loud. Like right out in front, it's legit, but inside the thing, it's like a federal crime. Like heads up, there's like
massive fines.
No, like incarceration. No, I know because my homie got busted spearing halibut in there. He had a whole racket. He had a buddy who had a kayak, and they like fitted a snorkel onto the kayak. So the guy on the kayak would make it look like he was paddling, but he'd never really paddle. And then my buddy under the water would like fin kick and stay underneath the kayak to cover the fact that he was like slaughtering mega halibut down there. And he would take like 5 big fatties for him and 5 big fatties for his buddy, and they would each get a day's limit, and then they would go out of the slough and park it on the beach and come out of the water with like a full double limit of mega halibut. He got busted for that.
Wait, in like the harbor?
No, the Carpinteria Salt Marsh. Carpinteria Salt Marsh. Carpinteria Salt Marsh. Carpinteria Salt Marsh.
You okay?
Shut up. She was looking confused. I wanted to move on. Look, that's a wetland. It's just like a low spot on a farm in Oklahoma. Low spot on a farm, that counts. Like, that's not necessarily a big, complicated ecological preserve. That's just a low spot that like catches some runoff from a couple of farms. But I gotta point something out before I move on. The size of the watersheds affect how productive the wetland is. Think about it. That little puddle gets like a 1/4 mile of drainage into it. It's a small watershed. So in that 1/4 mile, if there's just dirt, all you're gonna get in the puddle is dirt. But here's another wetland at the mouth of a giant river in Tierra del Fuego. That river is like 900 miles long, so this is like a 3,000 square mile watershed. So that wetland has a ton of material because the bigger the watershed, the more things that are accumulating in your wetland. Does that make sense to everybody? Wetland productivity is affected by the size of the watershed. And that's worth knowing.
What plant is that?
I don't know.
That's not
I don't know. It's South American. I don't know my plants. The College Board asks about a few things. Remember that these are called estuaries. We saw these on our field trip where freshwater meets saltwater. The College Board has previously mentioned these cypress swamps. It's a southern tree that lives in like wetland areas, swampy areas. It can dry out really, really dry, and then it can survive like pretty deep flooding. A couple of years ago, the world's oldest cypress was burned down by a messy meth addict who fell asleep and accidentally dropped an ember from his pipe and lit it on fire. This is a famous tree called mangrove. College Board asks about this one a lot. Mangrove is the only tree that can live in salt water, like straight up ocean water. They can sprout in salt water, they can grow through salt water, they can survive being under salt water. And if you're into dorky science stuff like me, they have snorkels. Because I think you'll remember that roots need nitrogen gas to become ammonium so that they can live. Nitrogen mostly lives as a gas, it's common in our atmosphere, and you can't fix it unless you're starting from gas. And so mangrove has snorkels so that they can get nitrogen gas down to the roots.
Do they like filter out the salt or something?
Yeah,
Does that mean that the nitrogen fixing bacteria is in the sand as well?
that's right. Thanks for asking. That's exactly what it means. Yeah,
That's so adorable.
I think so too. Okay, so why does this all matter? Number one, there's this thing called the nursery effect. Wildlife likes to make their babies here. You know, being a baby halibut in the ocean really sucks because the water is moving really fast and baby halibut just gets swept around. It's really hard to find food if you're getting tossed around in the ocean, and it's really hard to hide from predators if you're getting tossed around in the ocean. That's why mama halibut could release her eggs into the scary open ocean, but it's a lot more reasonable to leave the babies here where the water is calm and there's plenty of food and you're safe from predators. So wetlands provide what's called the nursery effect, like the place where you leave your babies so they'll be safe. Nursery effect. There's a lot of wildlife that comes to wetlands to breed. Ducks bring their babies here because it's a place where it's very convenient to feed baby ducks. The baby ducks can swim out onto the water to hide from predators.
Is it like the salmon that swim upstream?
Same concept. This is a place where wildlife has adapted to take advantage of the safety for their offspring. Nursery effect. Second benefit is that for humans. Wetlands are really important. They solve problems. What's it called when a living thing solves a problem?
Biological restoration.
Bioremediation. Living remedy, bioremediation. Wetlands are really good for humans. They solve a bunch of problems. If you've ever watched your maid or butler do your dishes, I have an analogy that'll help you. You have like the soapy water on this side with the sponge, and you like take all the leftover pasta sauce off your plates, and then you rinse water, and then you put them in the rack. How many of you have seen a human do this? Maybe once you did something really, really bad and you had to wash the dish or two? My new slogan is, Santa Barbara, California, we've got people for that. I'm glad you kind of laugh. I was at Harder Stadium watching the UCSB Gaucho soccer game, which is a tradition that I've had since I was a little boy. And I take my little boy to watch soccer games. And you all know that the UCSB Gauchos at Harder Stadium soccer games have a tradition. Whenever the Gauchos score a goal, they throw tortillas. And I've participated in this as a little boy, and I participated in this as a university student, and now as a grown-up, I just don't like wasting food, but, you know, if I have some crappy tortillas, I'll take them to the game. I was there the other day, and I see people throwing tortillas, and it kind of struck me, now that I'm a grown-up and I have children, like, oh yeah, someone has to clean that up. And like right after all the tortillas were thrown, I looked on the stadium, and there she is, some skinny white girl running around picking up all these tortillas. And there's like a track around Harder Stadium where people walk, and there's little groms down there picking up all the tortillas that didn't make it to the grass. And they all run around and they pick them up, and they do like the second round of tortillas. And the skinny white girl on the field, she's like, stop, I gotta pick these up. And the kids are like, they're like all throwing it. And my son and daughter were like, hey, let's go get some tortillas. And I was like, you guys, don't be that person. And I was like, this is so Santa Barbara. Like every time I talk to people about gardening, they're like, nah, I got people for that. Okay, anyway. I'm sure you've got people to wash your dishes, because it's a Santa Barbara. But if you watch them wash your dishes, imagine what happens when you pull the drain and you leave the sponge in the water on the soapy side. I do this all the time, because I hate doing dishes and I'm always in a hurry to get it over with. So just the other night I had to do a huge load of dishes. And watch, I had all my scummy soap water that was full of like tomato chunks and little bits of mushroom and like little pieces of basil leaf, because we ate pasta sauce and we do like chunky Latin America pasta sauce. And so I was like cleaning off all the plates and putting them in the rack. The dishwasher was full. And I pulled the plug and I forgot that the sponge was in there. So when I pulled the plug, I just walked away for a minute. And usually the water goes and it's gone. And I was gonna come back and like rinse it off and wash the sink, but it's kind of spaced it. And then I came back the next morning and I realized like, oh no. The sponge was left in there, and the sponge kind of blocked the drain a little bit. And that's how wetlands work.
So they block the drain?
Yeah, they block the drain. Watch. Number one, they filter the water. That's true. If you got like a dead cat coming down the stream, if you got a dead cat coming down the stream, it's going to get caught in all these shrubberies and whatnot, and it's going to get decomposed and broken down by all of these decomposers. Just like the sponge caught all the bits of pasta sauce and kept them from going down the drain. So number one, sponge effect, the filter. You gotta know this, I'm serious. The sponge effect is like a science term. Look, there's the nursery effect and there's the sponge effect. These are like real things about wetlands.
Did the sponge effect come from this example?
Did you call it? Did you make up the sponge?
Hint, I did not actually do the dishes the last time we ate pasta. It is a good analogy. It's the sponge effect is like actually, look, I got it on a slide, sponge effect. Going somewhere with this. Number one about the sponge effect, you filter the water. Number two, you slow the drainage. Unfortunately, your generation has been traumatized.
Which time?
By rapid drainage. Because you all remember that Montecito had a big ass fire, and then they had a once in a century rain event, and that massive amount of rain didn't have any place to soak in, and didn't have anything to slow it down, and it all came out at once, and I'm afraid some of you may have actually seen that, right? That was like pretty effing horrible, right? Because like water, an inch of water over 30 square miles is a lot of water. If your land works like a 30-mile tarp, an inch of water across all of that is gonna be a huge amount coming out of the bottom, but wetlands slow that down. Just like the sponge slows down the water flow in my sink. So they slow drainage. Number 3, they extend runoff. Like it hasn't rained in 9 months and there's still running water in some of our creeks because that soaks into the ground and then it drains out of the ground. Wetlands have a lot of dirt, it's loose. So they work like a sponge. They slow the drainage, and number 3, they extend the runoff. Number 4, wetlands encourage decomposition. There's a whole bunch of stuff there to break up material. Like wetlands are always full of stuff decomposing, so wetlands are really good at decomposing stuff. They encourage decomposition. By the way, every sponge smells like dirty, moldy socks if you keep it for too long because it's got microbes living in it. The funny thing is that, yeah, you can, and then the soap washes off and all the organic material that's left continues to decompose. Like you can wash shoes, but they still smell like a dirty shoe after a while. They just kind of have like an onboard odor. Sponges do that, decomposers. Same reason. Finally, benefit number 5. That sponge holds water for a long time and drips it into the ground. That's how we recharge groundwater. That's a huge human benefit. Here's everything I just said. The nursery effect, because fisheries really like it. Migratory birds really like to go to eat the little fishies. Good place to be a duck, good place to be a halibut. Plus, you know, like a sponge in the sink, they're gonna slow that water, they're gonna filter the water, they're gonna prevent flooding, they're gonna extend the drainage, and they're gonna seep into the ground. The College Board will definitely ask you about wetlands. They won't ask you too much about the ocean, maybe about acidification. They won't really ask you too much about like lakes, you know, maybe just a little bit about pollution in water. They don't really care about rivers too much, maybe pollution. But wetlands are big for the College Board. Important to wildlife, important to humans, fix problems. And this really sucks because it's a really good place for a farm and a really good place for a house, and we have almost no wetlands left. Some states like ours have lost more than 3/4 of their wetlands forever. Some states have less than 2% of their wetlands. The Mississippi River watershed used to have thousands of square miles of wetland, and now they're down to dozens of square miles of wetland. Almost all habitat restoration is wetland restoration, like you saw on our field trip. Raise your hand if you went on a field trip. Every restoration that you saw was a wetland restoration. It's really the only place worth fixing up, because it's that critical. Priority number 1. I am done with biomes unless you have a question for me. Yeah?
Since it's runoff, do like bad chemicals also get into the wetlands too?
Yeah, absolutely. So, because wetlands are really good at decomposing, stuff is pretty tough and can break down, can fix some types of pollution. So wetlands work as a chemical filter to improve. But wetlands are really susceptible to runoff quality. So like when we get a big rain in the foothills, there's like bird poop and snake skins. And when we get that same storm hitting downtown Santa Barbara, you get dirty diapers and cigarette butts and heroin needles. And both of those groups of ingredients go to the same wetlands. So A, they're good because they can help deal with some runoff. B, they're vulnerable to those types of runoff that they can't deal with. Like petroleum that drips out of every car, you know, little oil drips, like that all goes to water somewhere. Yeah,
Can we go back to the last slide?
guess. But you shouldn't be copying, I already said all that. Now, in your biome notes, I hope somewhere you have the word microbiome, because if you don't, I'll just give you an interesting hint. You guys know that I like science and I'm trying to get you guys into science. It's my worst kept secret. And all the biomes that I have to teach you are the big global biomes. Like in case something comes up about desert, you should know a few things about desert. But watch this. There are microbiomes which are not the common global ones. The microbiomes are like rare and unique little tiny once here and there places. And those have unique ecology too, but those are fascinating. If you ever get a chance to do science, that's really neat. Please look up. Like deep sea vents. Those are really rare. On the entire planet, there's a few, but they're totally unique. No photosynthesis. A whole chemical cycle not based on solar energy. Or redwood tops, the tops of redwoods. There's like flying squirrels.
They're so cute.
And like plants that grow on plants up there, and decomposers that never see the ground. And all those trees are communicating through their roots and through pheromones that go out through their needles. Or like vernal pools that we saw on our trip. We're like the only place in the world that in the middle of Chaparral there's these little puddles that last into the summer. These are pockets of unique ecology. They're called microbiomes, and those are neat. Our planet gets really exciting when you study those. Yeah.
So, like, would an example of the microbiome be like the different layers in a tropical forest?
Can be, yeah. They can break them up to having their own independent stuff. So, you know, like there's no like lines drawn anywhere. You could call this one biome or two or three or five, you know. So, but yeah, like if you study the tropical rainforest instead of as one big system as the little detailed layers, that's totally different and unique. A lot of those are pretty separated. You know, the tops of the Sierras. Like each tall mountain in the Sierra is like a little tiny island of alpine tundra that's disconnected from any other alpine tundra. So like, there's like little mammals, the pika, that are like genetically unique on every mountain. Because they've been like on an island in an archipelago. They're like all isolated. They're like separate little pockets. It's kind of neat. My kids know pika songs. Because we're dorks. All right. Done with biomes? The only thing that I wanted to add into lecture today is a quick story about this, which was in your endangered species stuff, but you should probably draw an 18 next to it. Can we switch to that really fast? The endangered species extinction lecture. Boys, can one of you please go to the the teacher's lounge, the copy room? There's some copies waiting for me. It's a box.
You want me to do it?
Thank you.
You need to pass. Whoever's going needs to pass. Okay. sincerely, I'm actually asking, because I can't remember who got which content.
Am I picking them up or giving them some?
You're picking them up. High genetic diversity, bottleneck, less diversity, founder effect, population can recover, but they're all clones. Does that all sound familiar? Actually, I'm asking, did I do all this already?
Yeah.
Okay. Now, I wanted to remind you that high genetic diversity is good for a population because all those genes might come in handy. Today, nobody likes redheads, but maybe someday those genes would be important, so we want that diversity to stay in our population. I'm so kidding. Everybody likes redheads. Do you guys know that there was like a cartoon on TV that made fun of redheads, and that started like a really common like cultural meme about making fun of redheads, but redheads.
South Park.
Right, but redheads have been like globally sought after. It's the most common hair dye. Did I tell you that? Almost 1/2 of all hair dye is red.
Yeah, except you don't want to be born.
You don't actually want to be a redhead.
I feel like there's a difference between like red and ginger.
Oh god. Oh god. This feels so wrong.
Yeah, because my aunt dyes her hair red,
Oh god.
but it's like bright red. It's like nobody's
Okay,
born
okay,
like that.
okay.
Like,
Hair is a whole bunch of genes. It's not a single gene. B, I like all jazz people. C, everybody loves redheads. But I bring it up because it's an easy, like, fast-going, like, is this diversity trivial, important, or not important? That's why I use
important.
it. Not important now. Okay.
Redheads are not.
It's important to keep that diversity because who knows? Maybe that comes in handy someday. That's my point about the full toolbox. That was actually content. So. There's this really cool critter called a panda. Raise your hand if you've seen a panda in real life.
I mean, like at a zoo.
Or on like YouTube videos. Yeah.
Every day.
So the panda is the cutest thing ever. They're like giant and they like tumble.
Baby
And
pandas.
they're like clumsy and snuggly. Oh, I love panda bears. They make little gross looking babies. All baby bears. And how many of you have heard of the Maoist revolution, the communist revolution, the Red Book, the Great Leap Forward? So Chinese land use patterns changed really quickly through the 50s, 60s, and 70s. By the time the world was getting interested in endangered species in the early 1970s, we wrote this thing called the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species, which was an international convention to protect endangered species. And at that time, everybody was worried about the whales. There's all these slogans about save the whales. And as a figurehead for conservation, people just discovered this wacky black and white adorable critter called a panda bear in China. And right around the time that the world learned of panda bears, we also realized they were rapidly going extinct. We got down to like 1,000 total bears, maybe less. And China at the time didn't have a ton of money for conservation efforts. The 1970s, the Chinese government was really trying hard to solve the whole starvation thing. China's economy was in no position to do large national conservation efforts. But everybody loves panda bears, and they were like, great, we'll just start breeding panda bears. And as a way to pay for this, we'll start renting them out to zoos. So they said, here you go, Los Angeles Zoo. You can rent a pair of pandas. It'll cost you $1.5 million a year. And here you go, Vancouver. You can rent 3 adorable panda bears, $2 million a year. And they go, San Francisco Zoo, you want 4? We'll call it $3 million a year. And at the time, conservation of panda bears means take a few, try to make them hump. Maybe you can raise the babies. And through the 80s and 90s, everybody made news like, oh my God, our panda bear's humped, and now one of them is pregnant, and we're going to get baby panda bears. And then like the LA Zoo, I think, was one of the first, and everybody's like, oh my God, there's a baby panda bear. And the LA Zoo was like, cha-ching, and they were just like printing money with these baby pandas. So all the other zoos were like, wait, Barry, what kind of music? Candles? They like candles? A jacuzzi? They're in the jacuzzi? Great. And they try to figure out how to make their panda bears hump. So the Vancouver Zoo made a couple of panda bears. The San Francisco Zoo made a couple of panda bears. P.S. They're all owned by China. China owns every panda bear. They're just on loan for money. Perfectly normal, perfectly rational. But maybe you understand a problem that came up in the 1990s when we started to learn more about genetics. In the 1990s, we started to learn that genetic diversity is important. And we started to see that, wait a minute, if those LA pandas become a separate gene pool and all of those Vancouver pandas become a separate gene, we're going to get a founder effect in a bunch of places, and we're going to lose some variety. If you take a population, you cut it up into little pieces, and you let them all inbreed, you're going to get the loss of genetic diversity because whatever they don't keep between them is lost. 1/2 of all genes go away in every breeding event. You understand that, right? So in the 1990s, China started a spreadsheet. And they fixed the problem. They artificially connected all the populations with airplane tickets, and now they make booty calls. For real. The LA Zoo, part of the contract now, the LA Zoo has to tell China, like, our girl panda's kind of getting into it. And China will be like, be right there. And they buy like a first class airplane ticket, a private jet, and they like fly a panda bear in a crate. And he like walks in and goes, I heard you needed my services. And they like stir up the gene pool, if you know what I mean. In very carefully orchestrated combinations to try to maintain maximum genetic diversity, so that now that we're down to like 1,000 and a couple of hundred of panda bears, we can make sure that they're all working like one giant gene pool. Because when you break up a population, you lose diversity, and that's bad. Anything that gets this guy sick will get them all sick. You understand that? If that's a genetic weakness, they're all left. So to rebuild diversity, China uses airplane tickets and booty calls to artificially replicate an interbreeding single population. It's kind of interesting, right? Like there's somebody whose job it is to like get them ready to fly, and somebody whose job it is to make sure that the girls are ready for the boys to show up. They ship the boys, not the girls. Interesting. I think this is, you guys are not interested.
No, I'm so interested.
Okay. That was the only lecture that I had to squeeze in. I wanted to make sure that I didn't forget the panda bear story because it's a fascinating one. Now I'm actually done. Who has questions from study goals? You could use any. The movie, the reader, maybe I skipped a word somewhere. Every period is different. I don't know if I missed something. I have like the lectures I plan and then the questions you ask. You can ask me whatever you want. I know. What is he doing? Calisthenics?
Scratching his butt.
He's scratching his butt. It's so cute.
Yeah.
So you get on there. You should put that right up on the screen.
Okay.
Let's do that while we're talking. Yeah. What do you? Yes. Just went over it. What's your question though?
What room are we in? 65.
65.
What's the overall sort of topic of it? 19?
Ask me a question.
It's about species management.
So back in the day, we used to just try to make more of something,
This is my animal.
and now we just try to fix ecosystems instead. Like the California condor, they were getting like electrocuted on power lines, and they were getting poisoned by lead bullets. And so we like took them into captivity and figured out how to make them hump, and then we let them go, and they died of the same stuff. So now we do what's called ecosystem management, which means instead of trying to just work on the species by itself, you work on the system. And we remove the power lines and we remove the lead, so that they don't need our help to make babies. We can just protect their system. It's called ecosystem management instead of single species management. He's a little rascal scratching his butt. What else? You follow how to practice yoga?
No, these are just.
Yes.
Chunky.
What?
I do follow chunky animals.
Those are mass extinctions.
This is my folder where I save all the pictures of animals that I see.
Anybody else?
Cats are pointless.
Shut up.
Ugh, cats are
Ginger.
horrible.
Pointless.
Oh, touche! Okay, anybody else?
Oh my god, this is so funny.
This will be your last one. That's not that funny. You may exit.
Wait.
You might want to leave before you start exposing your photo collections.
It's so funny, funny.
Yes.
It's like,
Number 48, it's just when they're asking how can the Florida's Everglades National Park be too
So even though it's giant, it's the end of the river. And all of the impact on the Everglades comes from upriver in like Miami all the way up to Orlando. So Florida has these huge rivers that catch a whole bunch of pollution and sewage. And then all that runoff spills into the Everglades, which is this huge complex of wetlands, but the water comes in dirty. So even though they protected the entire southern tip of Florida, like all of that is all the Everglades. There's stuff spilling in from all these cities. So it's pretty big, but not big enough to keep the water clean.
What's the edge of that?
Please look up. Ecotone is a place where two different biomes will overlap. That's called the ecotone. And where you overlap two biomes, you get this thing called the edge effect, which is higher diversity. Chloe, look at my hand real quick. Forest species, desert species. At the ecotone, you have both the forest and the desert species. Yeah.
Can we staple the field trip notes to our packet just to keep it? Or
Can't hurt, absolutely.
Okay.
Who else? Yes.
Is an estuary an ecotone?
I'm sorry, I can't hear you.
Is an estuary an ecotone or ecotone?
It is sort of an ecotone because you have freshwater diversity kind of overlapping with saltwater diversity. They're kind of like two biomes. At high tide, it's mostly saltwater. At low tide, it's mostly freshwater. And so it's kind of the border between fresh and salt. It's also the border between land and water. So it's technically a double ecotone or a super ecotone. That's why there's so much diversity. It's so dynamic. It's all these different ecosystems using the same space.
So entropy is the concept that like the energy gets less and less useful as it's used.
That is the almost. So I gotta pick on your words. Energy is less and less useful as it changes form.
Okay.
So any transformation of energy,
So like light to heat.
right, will have some inefficiencies, some chaos, some leakage of quality, some loss of usability.
That's
Yeah.
the laws of thermodynamics, right?
That's the second law of thermodynamics. Yeah. Yes,
So is the biological soil crust, is that the sand thing or is that something else?
that's the sand thing. Who else? Say something if you want to ask me a question. I'm about to transition. I have my back to the room because I'm putting something up. Last call for a question.
It says, why do people try to preserve nature to a state of natural balance? And then what's wrong with the idea?
I got you. We see environments changing. And when we think that's our fault, or when we know it's our fault, we're like, oh, I gotta put it back to how it used to be. And we build this idea that ecosystems are static. That there's this like balance point. And we always talk about that. It's a word that we use all the time in conservation. Balance, back to balance, it's out of balance. Problem is, it's totally bogus. There is no ecosystem on Earth that ever lives in one state for very long. All ecosystems are undergoing change. Change is normal, it's natural, it's constant. Things are always changing. So the shaky part is the idea that there's like a single state of perfection. We can still remove our thumb from the scale. We can stop adding changes. But ecosystems are not static. They're always changing. A new plant species will blow in. There will be a bigger storm this year, a smaller storm. There will be some disruptive force like a tsunami or whatever. They're always changing. Yes?
What is punctuated extinction?
Mass extinction. Yeah.
How has the IUCN proposed wildlife conservation be made more scientifically relevant?
So the incorporation of genetics, like this stuff, the IUCN was a part of. They make the red list. They're the ones who manage all the endangered species. So A, they started talking about genetics like the panda bear, and B, they talk about ecosystem management. The idea that you have to restore the system rather than just focus on the number of individuals in the species. Like making more condors and releasing them to get poisoned again is no good. You gotta fix the system before you start thinking about the number of condors. Yep?
How is animal and plant diversity distributed in biogeographical zones?
So I think in your book they're based on plate tectonics is the shortest answer. So clumps of diversity that's related because they evolve separately. Okay. We need to pass out the Unit 2 stuff. You keep all the homework, you keep your extra credit for evidence, but I'm going to collect the exam things. While students are passing out, I could meet with the kids who didn't attend the field trip. Who did not go on the field trip? Bring something to write with. Who did go on the field trip? I need all of you to pass out papers, like at least 8.
Jose?
Yeah.
Are you talking about this piece of paper? Is that what you're going to talk about?
Yeah, that.
What if they're outside?
Put it on the
That's me. What do you need? Nothing. The paper.
Oh, that's a hard one.
Can you guys let this help that?
Nah, I thought it was.
Students who did not go on the field trip, come find me up here, bring something to write with and write on.
Jose?
Yeah.
If I exercise my vote,
They're all
on the back of our notes.
You can organize your papers however you want. We just need stamps. No. If you didn't go on the field trip, last call. For those of you who didn't go on the field trip, most of the stuff that came up on the field trip already came up in lecture, or it's not going to be tested, it was just enrichment. So the kids saw some stuff about restoration that's cool to know, but not on the unit exam. And they saw some stuff that you already heard, like the succession lecture. There's just a few words that I want to highlight because I think the field trip helped. So I'm going to go in the order that they appear. I'm just going to hit like 5 terms. The first one, the Hollister Airport stop, where it says habitat value. That's the idea that some land is useful to more species than other land. Like an estuary is useful to freshwater fish, saltwater fish, sea stars and seagulls, and eagles and mice. So you have more habitat value if that area is habitat and more species. The more species that use it, the higher the value. So all ecotones, because they have more species, are really valuable. And an estuary is like a super. Next, there's this concept in restoration where if you do something bad, you gotta do something good to make up for it. That's called mitigation. So if you cut down a tree, you gotta grow 5 new ones. You're doing something good to make up for the bad things.
Oh, that the ratio is like one bad thing to 4.
And you'll notice I said 5 new
Sam?
trees, because one tree is always gonna be better natural than the 5 you planted aren't gonna be quite as good. They're gonna be smaller, they're not gonna be in the right place, some of them might be sick. So there's a ratio. Whenever you do something good to make up for the bad, you gotta do a lot of good. That's called the mitigation ratio. In habitat restoration, it's usually 1 to 4. So we went to a field trip where for every acre of creek that they messed up, they had to restore 4 acres of creek. Next, there's this term toward the bottom called an estuary. You'll notice I've used it a lot in class already. It's where freshwater meets saltwater, the mouth of a river. Also, ecotone and edge effect, I use them again in lecture today. Ecotone is a place where 2 biomes overlap. So it's kind of rainforest and it's kind of desert. They overlap. And the edge effect is what happens to biodiversity. Because the biomes overlap, you get the species from both.
Oh no, I'm not worried yet.
So higher diversity where they overlap. Then there was a bunch of stuff that was just kind of interesting or already showed up in your class. If you look toward the bottom, bioswales are man-made creeks. That one comes up nowhere in our class, but it's really important. I want to make sure that everybody knows that. A bioswale is when humans build a creek that's artificial. And those clean water. They're used to solve problems. They clean water, bioremediation. The last word that doesn't come up elsewhere is endemism. That means when a species is unique to a place. So for example, the island fox is found only on the Santa Barbara Channel Islands. So you say the island fox is endemic to the Channel Islands. Islands have a lot of endemic species, like they're only found on those islands. Some species have a lot of endemism. Islands, vernal pools, isolated pockets. All those microbiomes, they have a lot of endemism. Species only found there. Biome, they're adapted for that, they're not found anywhere else. Anybody want to ask anything? Okay, I'm gonna start yelling now. Liam, can you stop recording, please?
Yeah.